Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for being here. I'm Katie Earle, the coordinator of the University Express program, and I work for the Erie County Department of Senior Services. And we're here with Anna VanDien from the Wilson Support Center, which she's going to tell us more about today. Welcome, Anna.
Thank you for having me.
Of course, we're super excited for this and to learn about it. It's such an important topic for the community and all of us that we're experiencing it. So before we jump to your presentation, though, we've got some new folks, so I'll quickly go through the normal housekeeping. We are recording the session, and I'll try to post it on the website in the near future if all goes as planned. And you can communicate with us through your Q&A panel because you've joined muted and without your video showing, and it's not because you've done anything wrong. That's just the settings for the program. So if you're on a laptop or computer, you'll look at the lower right-hand side of your screen. You'll see the Q&A. Click on that, expand it, send your questions right to me. Or if you're on a tablet or smartphone, touch your screen. That brings up your control panel. You'll see a circle with 3 dots. Then you'll see Q&A, and same thing, send your questions right to me. So we hope you participate with us. And we'd like to thank the sponsors of our program, which is my Department of Senior Services, Blue Cross Blue Shield of Western New York, Excelsior Orthopedics, and Wegmans for their support. And Senior Services is at 858-8526 if you need anything. All right, our speaker today. Anna VanDien is the coordinator of the Wilson Support Center. In this role, Anna is responsible for triaging and personalizing grief support, supporting staff development, and fostering community relationships through education and training. She has former experience as a hospice social worker and dementia care advocate, and we're glad to have you. Anna, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. Hi, everyone. I want to thank you all for joining me today. Grief is something that we have all experienced in varying degrees, and yet it's something that can be really difficult to talk about. Part of this is because of our most concrete example of grief. It's related to death of a loved one, and that's a taboo topic, especially in the American culture. It's just one that we shy away from. So today, with your interest and your presence, we're casting those discomforts aside, and we're diving right in. So I'll start today just by sharing a little bit of the work that we do at the Wilson Support Center, as well as my background, which Katie has already beautifully spoken to. Then we'll look at defining loss so that we can explore how the different kinds of loss can cause grief. Next, we'll cover the work of grieving, how to discover coping strategies and self-care tools for yourself, as well as how to help others and support them in their grief. Throughout this discussion, I will point to some useful resources that you can reference as you need in the future. And my hope is that you can leave today feeling a little less apprehensive to speak to others about grief and better equipped to cope yourself or to support others. So this is a lovely picture of our Wilson Support Center located here in Cheektowaga on Bennett Road. You can take down our contact information if you're at all curious and want to arm yourself with that in the future. But the Wilson Support Center provides grief support to the Western New York community at large. We are perhaps best known for our delivery of hospice bereavement services. That's through our affiliation with Hospice and Palliative Care Buffalo. And because of that affiliation, we are housed on that hospice campus in Cheektowaga. The building has been pretty quiet over here for the past year. We've transitioned our services online, but we certainly are looking forward to the day when we can open our doors to the public and welcome you all inside to speak with our team and to access our growing resource library. At Wilson, as the coordinator, as Katie mentioned, I triage all of those incoming needs that we get from the community as well as from our active hospice team. So we're constantly seeking out new resources to add to our database, supervise our counselors, and collaborate with agencies in the community, such as providing education like this to help the public out in just general grief and loss understanding. I've been in this role for a while and been connected to hospice even longer, but as Katie mentioned, I do have a background in dementia, and that has an interesting corollary with grief and loss. It certainly is a unique experience and one that I'll speak to as this conversation goes on. So I think it's helpful to outline our services as this umbrella, because we do offer a wide variety of supports to the community at large, and then within that is the hospice bereavement services. So during normal times, we generally have support groups available. Those have all been paused. We utilize community facilitators, and so during the last year of ups and downs and really changing guidelines, we've just paused those. Some have started off on their own, which is great, but for now they're paused. I should also say that these services generally are open and free to the community. So that's something that is well communicated on our website as the changes take place. That's where we post updates. We do have some programming that are specific to youth needs as well. You may be familiar with Camp Blue Skies or with Storm Clouds and Rainbows. And Camp Blue Skies is a weekend retreat for younger folks who have lost someone in the last 5 years. So the idea being they may be quite young when that loss occurs, but perhaps later on in life, as they start to really grapple and process that loss, they have an avenue and other kids to support them in a way that they really understand because they've also lost someone. Storm Clouds and Rainbows is a youth-focused support group that we offer generally twice a year. Again, that is also paused at this time, hoping to offer some virtual in the future. Our other services can range from referring folks out to grief counselors in the community, identifying general resources at large, even nationally. We have a lot of educational materials that can provide support and reassurance. And then just linking folks to other agencies, certainly through senior services and the like, and then providing these sort of trainings or in-services to our healthcare agencies, but also to just folks in the community who want to learn more about this topic. Within the bereavement program at hospice, I think it's just helpful for me to provide a quick overview because a lot of folks are connected to our hospice program at one time or another, and there can be a lot of misnomers out there. So we do offer, as part of that hospice benefit, the loved ones connected to that patient who passes under hospice, they are able to access 13 months of individual counseling. There is no charge, no need for insurance. All of it is included under that hospice benefit. So we often offer family meetings if there's a specific concern that the family would like to discuss amongst all of them. There's parental coaching. A lot of parents are grieving while also supporting their little ones who are grieving, and that can be really overwhelming. So sometimes that individual counseling actually takes on more of a parental coaching session. We do have support groups that are specific to hospice folks, and we have a large correspondence program, which unfortunately over the past year has been altered without the support of our volunteers, but we are able to send out materials. We have a whole grief journal that's designed to support folks in those 13 months after the death, to talk about the coping mechanisms they may find helpful, self-care, how to manage difficult emotions, and just generally normalizing the grief experience. Because a lot of people will tell me they feel like they're going crazy. So sometimes just having that psychoeducation can be very helpful. And finally, we tend to host remembrance events on campus. Again, not for the past year. We were able to hold a virtual one in December, which was very meaningful, not only to our families, but even to our staff. We're going to talk more about rituals and the idea of legacy, but that's really important when we talk about grief. When we speak about grief, it's important to understand first the definition of loss. As Stephen says here, a single event of loss almost always contains multiple losses, and a current loss can trigger past losses. So when we're talking about one loss, there can actually be multiple pieces within that are triggering emotion. So for example, if someone loses a job or even chooses to retire, there are multiple losses within that, even if such as retirement, it's seen as a positive thing, it's seen as a choice. There is a change in identity, there's a change in priorities, certainly a change in routine. And that current experience of loss, of change, can trigger feelings related to losses from the past that may not feel like they're related, but in fact, and it's often not conscious, but in fact, upon deeper reflection, you realize, oh, this is causing more financial constraints and feeding into my feelings of inadequacy or my fear of providing for my family. And perhaps those were things that were issues previously. So it's important to kind of recognize how nuanced and diverse these experiences can be, which I think a lot of that is why folks often feel like they're going crazy, because there's just so much and it can be so overwhelming. The idea of these losses, of a loss, and the fact that it's a significant change, it's all based on the attachments that we form. Forming attachments is a natural human instinct. We all want to connect either with each other or with objects even. In this graphic, we see a mother holding her child and the child holding her doll. So each is significant to each of those individuals, perhaps in varying degrees, but losing one of those three could certainly elicit different experiences of loss. Because those attachments have been either changed or broken in the form of when we're talking about death, that attachment has certainly been broken in a way, and we'll even talk about how it's perhaps just changed. It all kind of depends on your perspective, but it's understandable that kind of within this system of attachments that, of course, it would affect everyone, and it would affect everyone differently. This can even be attached to routines. We can be attached to pets. It's really reliant on how the individual defines what's significant to them. You know, I think a lot of us have seen maybe friends of ours experience a loss of some sort, and we just can't believe that they're taking it so well. Well, the details of that may not be known to us, and there could be very good reasons for why that person is coping so well, or it wasn't as significant to them, whereas in our lives it would be. So it can be quite dangerous, in fact, to compare losses and grief in that way. So when we talk about grief is the process. It's an adjustment process to the result of these attachments being lost or changed. Okay. And I just wanted to take a moment to reflect individually, but as a group, collectively, just to acknowledge the fact that we've all had losses because of the last year that we've been through together with COVID. And it can help to keep some of these examples in mind as we talk through some of the concepts. I think this photograph is so powerful because it really provides a physical embodiment of what that loss can feel like to us. With each one of those stones in their varying sizes together, they just really create this feeling of overwhelming weight. And we're all doing our best to carry that, right? So some of these stones can be social, whether that's friends or family. Thinking of the past year, that physical separation, maybe conflicted relationships, certainly deaths there have been so many experiences of multiple deaths even. And the stones can also be personal. So that could be fear for your own health. Perhaps your own health has suffered, a sense of purpose, changing roles in your life, changing routines. If you work or if you've had to watch grandkids more frequently, if you haven't been able to see your grandkids. And some of those stones are just part of being human. We've all just experienced uncertainty in the last year, lack of clarity, and a blurry picture of what the future may hold. So I think this is a good exercise, just even looking at a picture like this and trying to connect that physical feeling to our emotions, that's exactly what engaging with grief ultimately looks like. When folks are doing quote unquote grief work, that's what it is. It's recognizing the feelings that are occurring within yourself, recognizing where that's hitting you in your body, and acknowledging that feelings are temporary. They may not feel that way always, but when we name them, you begin to work with those emotions and process the meaning of that loss. I think it was Mr. Rogers who said anything that is human is mentionable, and anything that's mentionable, you can, what was it? You can, if you talk about feelings, so basically because feelings are human, you can talk about them, and because you can talk about them, that makes them less overwhelming, less scary. What is grief? So grief is not a disorder. Earl Grolman here, who's actually a celebrated author on grief and coping, as well as a counselor and a rabbi, he's a wealth of knowledge. His quote here is great. Grief is not a disorder. It's not a disease or a sign of weakness. It's an emotional, physical, and spiritual necessity. It's the price you pay for love. The only cure for grief is to grieve. There's a lot there to unpack. There's so much in that short quotation. Grief is absolutely a natural response, just as we talked about. We form those attachments, and when those attachments are threatened or changed or taken away, of course, we would have a response to that. One piece that always strikes me about this is that Earl brought up the fact that we respond not only emotionally, but also physically and spiritually. There are so many elements to our beings that can respond in these moments of high stress and high sorrow. The other piece I wanted to mention is just that the idea, I'm not sure if Earl was the first person to say that grief is the price you pay for love, because it's something that we say quite frequently. In fact, I think the Queen said it recently when she lost her husband. But that is mostly true, right? I think we all can acknowledge the people that we love in life, we will grieve deeply. Or the folks that we have lost in life, we have grieved deeply. But it's also true that folks have very conflicted relationships in life. And sometimes the grief that we feel after those losses is different and perhaps more difficult because it is muddy, because there were things that were said that were hard to reconcile. And so that, again, that's another good example of how that grief can manifest very differently for one person versus another person. So here's some information on the physical response to grief. I think that it surprises people a lot that their body is responding in a physical way. It's not just emotional, but your body is a system, and all those systems are connected. So frequently we see, of course, fatigue, just wanting to stay in bed. That's a lack of motivation, but it's also just a lack of energy. Grief is an exhausting experience. The changes in appetite, headaches, aches and pains, all of these things that can be a sign of stress, but we never quite know what that source is. It can be a part of grief. The one piece here it's in the mental state. Here's the other one, mental state. Sadness, inability to sleep, anger. Also the idea that your short-term memory changes, so the cognitive effects. I talk to a lot of people who say in their first month, 2 months, that they just can't keep anything straight, they can't remember anything, and they're feeling very unlike themselves. And of course they're concerned that that's dementia, but the reality is it's just the grief response, and it can be that strong. So that's I think another surprising piece for folks to learn, that that's normal. And it's important to keep an eye on all these things, of course. I always encourage people to see their doctors in these times of high stress. because we don't want to miss something just because you're also grieving, right? There could be something underlying. We always want to rule that physical piece out. But don't feel like you're going crazy, because there's actual science to back up that this is a normal response to grief. There are many, many types of grief and of loss. Because of my experience at Wilson and with hospice, many of those are death-related losses. So I will highlight the primary kinds that we find with chronic and terminal illnesses. That said, please remember that a loss can be anything significant, so it doesn't have to be a death. And I'll try to highlight that in some of these other ones, and some of these types of grief. But I just put that out as a disclaimer because I know myself. All right, so first let me just highlight three that are especially prevalent during and after COVID. Collective loss. So this is a loss that's shared across communities. It's something that, because we are all experiencing, we have a shared understanding of. And this makes me think a lot of last spring, when people just generally got what was going on, right? Everyone just understood that these were new challenges, and we were all just doing our best to adjust and figure things out. There's also cumulative loss. So over the course of the last year, as COVID has continued, these losses of routine, perhaps of our loved ones, even just not being able to see the people that we're used to seeing, those losses continue to pile up, and they can result in a form of overload. And what happens when we feel overloaded is we often avoid. So it's a very common defense mechanism. We just kind of set that on the shelf. We'll get to it when we have the capacity to get to it, but that's not right now. So you just don't let yourself go there. And that's completely appropriate for a short-term coping strategy. It's a protective reflex to make sure that you can continue to do what needs to be done. The concern is that you'll never get there, and that it will never be addressed, and then it'll pop up in ways that you don't anticipate and could be detrimental. It's also likely that through that avoidance, the onset of your grief is delayed. And we'll get into delayed grief in the next slide, but delayed grief can also result in prolonged grief. So that idea of more intense grief later and longer, which is not something that we would want, of course. Disenfranchised loss or disenfranchised grief. This is the idea that someone who's grieving may feel like they're not worthy to grieve. Oftentimes this takes the form of, if we just think of someone who dies and their family members are all included in the funeral, all included in the obituary, but perhaps an ex-spouse is not, and that ex-spouse maybe spent decades with that person, but they're not the current partner, especially if they weren't a parent to their children, if there were children, that's, so the ex-spouse is one that is always kind of in the back of our minds as grief professionals. Coworkers even, because coworkers see each other every day, and yet when someone dies, we are not always included in that ritual of a funeral, of a memorial, of a shiva, whatever it might be, to pay homage to that individual. And so sometimes, because there's not spaces or places carved out for those folks to grieve, it can feel like they're not allowed to, and that it's not worthy. I also think about this in our world between the relationship with a professional caregiver and the patient, because whether that professional caregiver is a home health aide or one of our nurses, that is a very intimate relationship. And in fact, most people that are going to be at that at that patient's memorial service have not seen them the way that this professional caregiver has, and so so when we talk about professional caregivers, there certainly needs to be support around them at their professional place of work, so that they have that grief support. All right, so here's delayed and prolonged grief. So as we were talking about, that grief response is suppressed and then experienced much later. This can lead to chronic grief, which we also call prolonged grief. And that's the idea that it's you're still functional, but you just don't feel like yourself and you can't do much to break out of that. It can often end up being diagnosed as depression. The interplay between grief and depression is probably worth a whole nother presentation, but that's oftentimes they are correlated and included under a medical viewpoint. And there's a lot of support that's needed to adjust to life after loss, especially in these circumstances. I think I mentioned there is, according to some researchers, a relationship between that delayed grief then becoming prolonged grief. Right, anticipatory grief is probably the most common when we see people who have chronic illnesses or may experience a prolonged decline due to a terminal illness. So if folks are given that 6 months of a prognosis, that period then can enter the anticipatory grief period, not only for them but for their care circle, the people around them. And it's an experience of grief that anticipates the death or anticipates the loss. I'm thinking back even to our retirement example. That's something, if you know you're going to retire in 6 months, you might think differently about every interaction that you have with people. So that could also be a form. And this, again, when we talk about where it started, what the onset is of grief, that's going to be different between people. It could be when I first start recognizing so-and-so's symptoms, or it may not be until we actually hear the diagnosis. Or it could be as late as when we hear the 6 months or less prognosis. I know I've worked with people before where it doesn't seem to hit until the final decline, when that person can no longer walk or talk. And at that point, that I wouldn't even really call that anticipatory grief, right? We're talking about these longer stretches of time that give you this opportunity for meaning making. As grueling as it can be to watch someone decline during that time and anticipate a death for a long period of time, I guess if you find the silver lining, it is the opportunity to have that renewed appreciation for the time you have left, kind of addressing those bucket list items, saying the things that need to be said, doing the things that need to be done, and even considering how you would like to say goodbye. Ambiguous grief, it's a grief that occurs when someone is physically present and psychologically absent, or vice versa. So let me give you some examples, because I think that's when it makes the most sense. So in the case of dementia, this is very common. Physically, that individual is there with us, but psychologically they have changed. It's not the person that you had the relationship with. This can be attributed to even long distance friends or family, deployment, and then also miscarriage. So the idea that physically that life is no longer there, but psychologically it may feel like you still have that connection. A secondary loss can be either concrete or abstract. So the idea that you lose that person, but you also lose a lot associated with that person. So if I have a client who lost her father, she was caregiving for him. That can be, there are secondary losses to that. Perhaps they were living together and now the income looks different. She can't stay at his home anymore. In some cases, there's a loss of business. There could even be friends or community that maybe that daughter engaged with while taking care of her father that will no longer meet up with her in the same way as they did before. And then there's also the abstract. So if that's her last surviving parent, that identity changes not only as a daughter, but also now as a caregiver. You know, she doesn't have anyone to take care of anymore. That could also impact her sense of purpose, self-confidence. A lot of people experience a loss of faith or a change faith, a questioning of faith, and those hopes and dreams, the hope perhaps for that daughter that that her father would meet her children, you know, those dreams for the future that will no longer be. And traumatic loss, I'm just going to throw this up there because there are a lot of kind of criteria that would fit a traumatic loss. And it almost, again, I have all of these up here, but it almost, the most important thing that matters is how that person perceives it. So, you know, even in hospice, we hear from folks that their person died a traumatic death because it wasn't something that person was prepared to witness. And so even though us as professionals, this is our work, and we think that it was a death that was under the circumstances of this patient's wishes and as comfortable and kind of, you know, we always strive for that death that the patient asks for upon admission, but that may not be what the family is prepared for. Of course, you know, you can read through this list, and this is what we see more on our Wilson Support Center community arm, and it happens more than you would ever realize, and that's a sad fact of the world we live in, but thankful that there's a lot of grief supports out there in our community. All right, complicated grief is the idea that when someone is grieving, their grief becomes complicated by maladaptive thoughts, by dysfunctional behaviors. They may have a physical impairment because of their grief, and it results in just a continued yearning and longing, really a preoccupation with thoughts and memories of that person. Their life becomes dominated by the grief of this person. And it can lead to something that in the counseling world we refer to as persistent complicated bereavement disorder. It's not a true diagnosis yet. It's a provisional diagnosis that's it's being studied. There's a lot of, again, that could be a whole nother presentation on the pros and the cons of actually putting a diagnosis like they're out there, because as I said at the beginning, grief is not a disorder, but a lot of people have very complicated responses to it that with their other experiences of mental health and emotional expression, it could mean that they need more support than someone else. And by making a diagnosis means that insurance can pay for it and they can access counseling. So there's a lot of interesting work around that hopefully we know more of in the future. Okay, I'm going to run through these approaches to coping. I don't want to take up too much time, but I do want to give you guys an idea of what kind of the experts have said throughout the years. So we'll start with Freud, which was about 100 years ago. He says mourning comes to a decisive end when the subject severs its emotional attachment to the person who's been lost and reinvests that free energy in a new object. So that is just not at all what we have come to understand anymore. We understand that you can't just turn off that love and focus it towards something else just because that person died. But that's where we started. Many of you are probably familiar with the 5 stages of grief from Dr. Kubler-Ross. Her work was really significant in that it was the first work to really focus on death and dying and the needs and emotions and experiences of someone who was terminally ill. And so she began to untangle that complexity of grief. But often those 5 stages are referred to by people who are grieving after someone has died. And in reality, Kubler-Ross intended for her work to be focused on the person that was dying. So there are a lot of people that I talk to that identify with the 5 stages of grief. They feel it's very helpful. and that's wonderful. We're in the field where we are now, that is not something that is on the precipice anymore. We understand that there are not stages that you can just walk through and kind of like a checklist and say, okay, I'm done with anger now. Instead, and also it's not in order, right? You can feel depressed before you feel like you're bargaining. Anyway, so from Kubler-Ross, we have Mr. Warden, who instead said, okay, I think there's actually 4 tasks of mourning. It's a nice little acronym here, TIER. Accepting the reality of the loss, experiencing the pain, adjusting to life without the person, and reinvesting in a new reality, like a new normal, if you will. Okay, this is a little bit closer to like what we've come to understand now, but it's still in a task model, which we in counseling don't care for because we realize how different everyone's experience is. And again, it shouldn't feel like a checklist because grief is something that we continue to live with. So Dr. Berger then focused on identity, an identity focus, 5 different ways that people can grieve. And so this was another kind of idea that was put out there and continued to work on. I'm not going to go through it here because I want to get to the like coping pieces, but it brought us to where we are now. So this is one of the 3 theories that we continue to work on, which is continuing bonds. The idea that we continue a bond, we continue that attachment even after someone has died. All of that love is just focused in a different way. And so we instead work towards discovering a new relationship versus quote unquote letting go. Okay, so some of these examples would be continuing to speak to the person that has died or visiting that loved one in their final resting place. A lot of people cherish keepsakes, and that extends that feeling of connection for them, or even rituals. So the idea that every year on so-and-so's birthday, this is what we do, right? Because this was their favorite hobby or this was their favorite place. So that allows you to carry on that legacy, carry on that attachment. This is also much more culturally attuned. So the idea that you're carrying on an attachment in a relationship versus severing it is much more similar to like some Japanese rituals to provide offerings to the ancestor spirits, or Dia de los Muertos is a celebration for those who have died in Mexico. So this is also kind of acknowledging the greater sphere. It's not just focused on white America. Then we have the dual process model, which is one of my favorites. I think it really connects with people. The idea being that you have the loss-oriented tasks on the left. So the things that are the true grief work, as you see, the talking about your feelings, acknowledging that, reviewing what that meaning was in that relationship. And then you also have the restoration-oriented tasks on the right. So the reality that life continues on, even though you've had this significant change in your life or you've lost a significant person, you still have to attend to things. You still have to take care of, you still have to wash your feet, you still have to wash the dishes, and you have to go to work, and you have to pick up so-and-so, and those things continue on. And the idea in this dual process model is that through oscillation, so you see that in the middle going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, that is the oscillation throughout the day of going into the loss-oriented, the restoration-oriented. What the researchers in the dual process model state is that ideally you're able to oscillate between these 2. Any time spent that's too much in loss-oriented, that means that you're not able to acknowledge or experience life, the life that is kind of passing you by. And if you're on too much on the other side, then you're avoiding. Then you're only delaying and prolonging your grief experience, right? So that's a good one that I think really connects to people because they acknowledge that, oh yeah, like I'm crying all of a sudden over lunch because I'm not oriented in my restoration. I'm orienting to the loss now because I'm not busy. Right, and finally, we have the idea of constructivism. There's a lot within this theory, but as far as grief, it basically states that we have this assumption of the world as a safe and kind and good place. But when we lose someone or something significant changes in our life, that alters that assumption of the world. And it can take a lot of work to get back to that assumption and that belief. The idea of narrative therapy, so using journals, poetry, letters, that is a technique used in therapy that is heavily relied upon constructivism. All right, so let's get into how you can help yourself, and then we'll talk about how you can help others. When we talk about grieving, there are two things that I consider. The first is how you cope in the immediate, right? What are the tools that I can use in this moment to manage my feelings of grief? So these are just some examples. I find that you need several different coping strategies, and because not all of them work in every moment. And also, they mean the most when you come up with them yourself. So I can put this list of, 7 down, and none of them may help you. You have to really consider, what is it that makes me feel safe, makes me feel okay, brings meaning to my life. And these are just some of the more frequently noted ones from clients. And again, thinking about, especially in those situations, I often hear about the grocery store. The grocery store can be a very triggering place. And it's not a place where you can necessarily scream. So, you have to find things that are going to work for you, especially once you've identified what spaces you're especially triggered in. Some good stats to show that time with friends and family is really a huge coping strategy, and there's a lot of research behind folks who have at least one support person in their life do vastly better in coping with their grief than folks who are isolated. So I think that all goes back to this. Listening to music, spiritual or faith practices are also huge. I like to point out exercise or activity because that can actually impact your neural or your cognitive pathways and kind of almost trick yourself into feeling better because of all the hormones that are released. So ultimately it can help your grief emotions as well. So then the other piece that we think about with grief, other than in that moment, is the overall adapting to change, right? Kind of the longer term view. And this is a graphic that I like to show because it's true. It's something that I hear time and time again. We expect this one thing on the left, that before the loss, this is what our life is like, and then the loss is going to feel like this, and then eventually it'll just be this little part of our lives. But in reality, loss is as big as we expect, and then eventually it actually inhabits more of our life than we realize. And this just always makes me think of the fact that we don't talk about things either. So if it's taking up that much of your life, but you're not able to talk about it, what's happening? So how do you adapt to change? First of all, you just have to acknowledge that you're doing the best that you can. The fact that you guys are all here and you're asking questions like this to yourself is huge. So give yourself that credit. This is an extraordinary time. Number 2, start with those basic needs. I know it sounds simple, but oftentimes I notice when I need to kind of realign my life, it's because I've been neglecting those basic things. So sleep, diet, exercise, or activity, if you don't want to think of it as exercise, get back to those basics, and all of that can take better physical health of you and will also take better emotional health. Finding activities that you enjoy, again, kind of that restoration-oriented idea. Setting limits on your screen time, whether that's personal or work-related. Just lay those boundaries down and determine how you're going to interact with those mediums so that you can still feel informed and connected, but also leave time for instance, activities that you enjoy. And finally, this can often be the hardest one, asking for and accepting help. I briefly talked about rituals. Rituals can be very important. Oftentimes it is easy to get into the formal rituals of, like I mentioned, a funeral, a memorial, a shiva, whatever is expected of that end of life moment. But often what we hear about as most meaningful is actually a personal ritual. So something you do on your own, to that is kind of a specific and meaningful action related to your relationship to that person. These are just some examples, but again, you really have to tailor it to what comes up in your mind when you think about that person, what was meaningful between the two of you, whether that's listening to Beatles music or I had one woman who just wanted to bring all of her friends to her mom's favorite place for lunch. And just that's how they that's how they celebrated Mother's Day. And what would have been an awful day ended up being a really special day. And so that's an example of a really important ritual that now they can repeat every year if they'd like. I'm going to come back to this if we have some time. And we're going to get to how to help others. Because I have a feeling a lot of you are wondering this. I think first of all, just acknowledging the death and their grief is a huge, I mean, that's in and of itself is a huge help. Those are topics people aren't comfortable with. Even in this work, I'm not always comfortable with it. You know, I'm very good in my professional life, but in my personal life, it can be hard to kind of practice what we preach because that role looks different. Language is so powerful. This slide is all the things that we hear so often that are not helpful. This is not helpful. We know that people mean well. We know people are uncomfortable and they end up saying things that come out wrong, right? The other thing I hear from people a lot is it's not your job to make me feel happy. It's your job to listen to me. And ultimately, I think when we ask for some of these language pieces, it comes down to just listening. It's not about saying anything at all. It's about just being there. So for some alternatives, these are some other things that you could say. I like the one in the middle because I often feel like I don't have the right words, and sometimes that's all you have to say is that you wish you did. Also, when people are really activated and crying, sobbing, you know, just know that I'm here. Just know that I care. Take your time. Those go a long way. They go a long way. And they don't make the other person feel like you're dismissing their feelings, right? I also acknowledge that not everyone can do that. I think that's fair that not everyone can sit down and be a support person during a highly emotional moment. If you're more of a physical person, these are some other great ideas of how to actually help people. The other thing I hear a lot is, oh yeah, all these people offered help, but you know, I don't even know what to ask them for. If you really want to help someone, I think offering something is much more helpful. And depending on your relationship with them, even like not giving them the option. You know, I'm bringing over a meal Tuesday or Wednesday better, you know? That's how you really show support because people do not want to feel like they're burdening others, but you really want to help. So that's how you can help. I did quickly just want to make a mention of children because I know that we all have children in our life one way or another, and children are inevitably hit by grief, and it can be very different. So yet another potential topic for an entire presentation, but I want to at least highlight that children respond naturally very differently than adults, and it can be really off-putting as an adult to see this child vacillating between grief and activity so quickly. So they may be crying with you 1 minute and then they get up and go play. That's totally fine. That's how they process grief. It's going to be in little chunks like that. it's great that they're engaging with you and talking with you, and it's great that they're able then to go to that restoration-oriented task, right? So that's how they're taking care of themselves, but also addressing what's going on. They're going to ask you so many questions, and these questions can be very off-putting again, because you may not know the answer to all of them. And that's okay. You can say, I don't know, or you can say, what do you think? If you ever have questions about their questions, you can contact us. That's something that we kind of role play with over the phone quite frequently. And we have a lot of great materials that are child focused. The thing I would note is that any significant behavioral change should not be ignored. And always looping in with their school is going to be huge, because they are at school for most of the time. Again, outside of like virtual school. Those significant behavioral changes can be our red flags that perhaps there's something unaddressed there that we need to bring up. So when you do speak to them, just make sure that you're open and honest. You're clear. Don't use a lot of words they can't understand. You don't have to get into the nitty gritty. It's okay to share your emotions. You know, we don't want you to be bawling, but it's okay to tear up and say, I'm sad too, I miss so-and-so too. That shows them that modeling, and that's okay for them to A, feel that way, and B, cry as well. And finally, take care of yourself if you're taking care of kids, because again, that modeling will take place where now they know how to take care of themselves. And the reality is you can't take care of them if you're not taking care of yourself. That empty bucket analogy just comes up in so many ways. So I am going to just highlight these community resources, and then I'm going to be quiet so you can get to any questions. The Alzheimer's associations and any of the local hospitals have their own, not only grief materials, but grief services, even if it's just a support group. The Western New York Perinatal Bereavement Network is actually housed out of the Wilson Support Center, and they do wonderful work for women and families that are experiencing perinatal loss. There are many support groups outside of us with the Compassionate Friends. They're specifically for child loss, and also have groups for adult siblings. COPE stands for Connecting Our Paths Eternally. That's another support to families who are grieving the loss of a child. Friends of Survival is suicide. GRASP is for grief recovery after a substance passing. Soaring Spirits is for folks who have lost a partner or a spouse. And VITAS Healthcare has been doing a great job over the pandemic to offer a lot of general support groups and COVID-related support groups to folks virtually. Okay, so reach out to us anytime that you have a question about grief and loss. If you're trying to support someone else, if you're looking for help yourself, we will offer support and link you to whatever your individualized need is. All right, we have several minutes left for any questions. I'd love to hear from you all. I'm going to check the question box myself.
Okay, perfect. You let me know what you're seeing. I've got quite a few that you've already answered, but there's still some here that we can talk about. And while you're pulling that up, I just want to thank you so much for that presentation, Anna, and walking us through that in such an easy to digest and understand type of way.
Absolutely, thanks. The first coping slide, the initial things one can do. Yes. All right, someone just asked to see the first slide that we talked about, coping. We'll share that. Great, I'm glad it was helpful. What do you recommend if I avoided contacting loved ones after the loss of a loved one? How do I break the ice now? That's a good question. I think you go to them and you maybe say, I guess I'll put words in your mouth because I'm guessing, that you've probably felt unsure of what to say, unsure of what to do, felt like your words would fall flat, just say that to them. I wish that I could have been there then. I realize now how much you needed me, and I hope that I can be there for you now and in the future. I hope that's helpful. Those are tough conversations, though. That's but it will mean the world to that person.
I'm seeing a couple more here that looks like they're just sent to me, but I'll let you pull up the PowerPoint first so you don't have to multitask.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay.
Let me know if you need my guidance.
I think I just need to click it again. How's that look?
Perfect.
Great.
Thanks for putting that up. This next question is, how can you get past feeling guilty even though you did your best, like the feelings of I should have done more, etc.?
Yeah, guilt, regret. I think a lot of that, when I hear about guilt and regret, to me, that's a big flag that you may benefit from counseling, because that's something that really needs to be analyzed and combed through. And it may take a while for you to believe, right? But it is so, so helpful to have a neutral party like a counselor who isn't going to tell you what you want to hear. They're going to tell you their perspective from an outside view, and really pick up all the pieces that you may be overlooking. Without knowing the specific circumstance, that would be my suggestion. It can be hard to do alone.
Thanks, Anna. The next thing is, what about grieving the loss of someone but they're still alive?
Absolutely, that anticipatory grief, right? Again, without knowing the specific circumstances, a lot of people will start counseling before someone dies too, because they are managing all of those grief emotions while potentially caring for that person. So the triggers maybe are even compounded. But that's something that happens a lot. And there's also a lot of anticipatory grief around people who are using substances, and whether it's that or a caregiver, both of those kind of populations have a lot of support groups available. And I would really encourage you to seek those out, and connect with other people who are also experiencing that anticipatory grief before someone has died, because it is unique. It's a unique space to be in.
Yeah, for sure. The last question I'm seeing here is, how can you cope with grief when you never had closure?
Mm. That is part of what can create that prolonged grief or unresolved grief. That's what it sounds like. That may not be something that you even recognize until another experience of death, another experience of grief. And it gets kind of messy and can be tangled. I hate to sound like my answer for everything is counseling, but I really do think that that's an element, especially where you need to talk through that and process that with a counselor. Yeah, because I guess the one thing maybe you could do on your own, because I'm thinking as a counselor, I'd probably suggest someone engage in letter writing. So when we don't have the closure that we feel like we would have liked, it's almost like we were robbed of something. And the way you reclaim that is often by writing a letter, whether that's to that person or just in general, maybe to your future self, and gain that closure in a new way. Maybe it's not the way that you saw it happening, but it's a way that you can reclaim it for yourself.
Thanks, Anna. We'll give it another second here to see if anyone else has questions, but I have one for you.
Sure.
I'm wondering if you can talk with us about the timeline, maybe how long the grieving
Mm,
process takes, or when I should know that I should reach out for professional help. What does
yeah,
that look like?
thank you. Yes, that's a big one. I can't believe I didn't even touch on that. I think part of it is because we don't like timelines. I think again, when it goes back to that expectation of yourself and what your grief is going to look like, oh, well, in a couple of months, everything will be, my normal routine will have come back. Um, and many people are surprised to hear that the hospice bereavement program lasts for 13 months because that seems like a long time. Um, the reality though is that through that first year, you're going to be experiencing triggers, and whether it be birthdays or holidays, or even things that are less defined. And we have 13 months and not just 12 months of bereavement because we need to get you past that initial 1 year anniversary of the death. So I would say, there's no normal timeline. When you feel like your daily life is being impacted and you just can't, um, you can't get any sort of sense of meaning, or you should still have moments of joy even if you overall feel sad. Those are kind of red flags that maybe you need some extra support, um, because the reality is we don't want you in the thick of grief forever, even though we acknowledge that in some ways we grieve forever, because that relationship has changed. So it's a tricky question because there's not a clear answer. But as far as when to ask for help, I would definitely say that if you're thinking about it, reach out, first of all. And second of all, if you feel like that daily life has changed, if your personal relationships are affected, if your work relationship is affected, um, it's time to at least see what sort of supports are available to you, and then you can feel it out from there.
Thank you, Anna. Um, could you ever give us the phone number to the Wilson Center again, please?
Yeah, let me.
While you're looking for that, we have someone that wanted to share. It says, not a question, just to let you know it's going on 3 years for me. So thank you
Hmm.
for sharing that with us.
Yeah, and there's a lot of reasons why that timeline can be different too, right? Especially like amidst COVID, it's it's all just accepted. We're all in a lower capacity for taking on any sort of need to cope. So that's part of it. Multiple deaths can be part of why the grief extends. Um, it's 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 so difficult because everyone has such a different experience.
Absolutely. And the last thing I'm seeing here is when we have family celebrations, we serve something that our deceased family were known for.
I
Thank you.
love that. Yes. A great example of legacy. Carry on those recipes, those traditions.
Try to get them just right. Remember that taste?
Yeah, it's never quite the same, is it?
No, still a lot of
But
love,
that's
that's for
okay
sure.
too. Yep, that's okay too.
Oh, well, now I'm just saying thank yous. Thank you for talking about this topic. Thank you for
Mm.
all your agency does. So Anna, I appreciate you for doing this with us and going on this journey and educating us all, and to everyone who's on, thank you for your time.
Happy to be here. Thank you all.